Hello everybody. In this video today we are going to talk about the exemption method. That is the third of the four methods to avoid double taxation, which are known at least in German law. So the basic idea is already disclosed by the name. The foreign income is left tax-free, so it's exempted from taxation. Naturally, that doesn't happen with all income, but where the exemption method is applied, there the foreign income is simply left tax-free. So imagine you have a taxpayer, let's say it's K from Kleve in Germany. That taxpayer earns 100,000 euro in Kleve and another 200,000 from a permanent establishment of his shop in the Netherlands. Now, under the double taxation treaty with the Netherlands, it shall be stipulated that these 200,000 shall be taxed in the Netherlands and that Germany shall apply the exemption method so that the 200,000 will be left tax-free in Germany, naturally with the idea in the back of one's mind that they have already been taxed in the Netherlands and that so this way a double taxation shall be avoided. Yeah? So, very simple, basic idea, no problem. You may now get a problem when you look to that method, because if you look a bit to the details, then constellations become possible, like you have a foreign tax rate. Imagine that were the case now in the Netherlands, although it's naturally a fiction what comes now. Imagine the foreign country has a low tax rate of 10%, and the country where you live has a rate of 60%. Naturally, that would generate a strong incentive to shift income to the other country and to profit from the exemption method. Naturally, you always have the feeling that if you can choose between investing in your own state and paying 60%, or investing beyond the border and getting away with one's 10%, you will naturally try to choose the 10% alternative. That's, by the way, the difference to the credit method. The credit method leads to the effect that you always end up with the higher tax level of both. The exemption method leads to the effect that you always get away with the local tax level of where you have just invested. Now, as I said, offering the taxpayer a possibility to get away with a very low tax without that an additional amount is levied by your home state is in principle very dangerous for your economy. We even said in the very beginning of the lecture series that this is the basic idea behind the creation of an unlimited tax liability. You need to tax the income from all over the world in order to exclude the possibility that people could get away with a lower taxation abroad. So the exemption method seems to violate that principle. Now you can get away with a lower tax rate abroad. So the first thing you need to understand is the exemption method can be regarded, at least from a theoretical perspective, as a very dangerous method. So you will offer it only under conditions and only for situations where you do not fear or do not have to fear that people shift investments which they otherwise would have made in their home state to another country. Yeah? So first general conclusion which we can draw is it would be very, very unwise to offer the exemption method for cases where people might shift the income from the residence state to another state. Good. Now, when we say that the exemption method can only be offered for investment alternatives or for activities better, where you do not have to fear that you shift this activity abroad just because of the tax for which activities can you then grant the exemption method? Well, in theory or in literature, these activities are the so-called active activities. So active means where you really do something in a foreign country, where the foreign location really and actually has an importance and an influence on what happens. That is rather abstract, so you will not be able to understand it without examples. Let's imagine that somebody offers you to invest your capital, 10 million, and you can choose between 3 different locations. One location has a tax rate of 10%, the other one has one of 30%, and the third one has a brutal 50% income tax rate. Now, if you ask yourself and others, which location would you prefer? The first idea is always, naturally, I take the 10% location. Now, if I present you the details, I would say, congratulations, you opted for the 10% locations, so you decided to set up a hotel at the North Pole. Because in my example, a hotel at the North Pole is that investment for which you get the 10% rate. Congratulations. Usually then you are no longer so happy as before. Why? Well, a very simple effect. When you erect a hotel at the North Pole, there will be a 10% tax rate, at least in my example, but there will be no gross income, or your gross income will be brutally lower than in the middle of Frankfurt City. So what you can learn here is, when you now hear about the 10% alternative and get the details, and you see your gross income, your gross profit at that new location is completely different from the gross profit which you can make in the city of Frankfurt, then everything changes for you. You are no longer happy with your former decision to choose the North Pole as investment location. So what we can say is, you can risk to present people the exemption method if you have an activity where the foreign location generally and actually and honestly changes the other circumstances also, and where these changes have a material extent. So if you hear the details, you would probably prefer to set up a hotel in Mallorca at the Balneario number 6 and pay 50% taxes there. By the way, it's not 50% in Spain. I don't know the rate of Spain, but just as an illustration, you would probably prefer to set up your hotel building there, pay 50% tax rate, and keep the rest of an enormous gross profit instead of running a hotel at the North Pole, having no profit at all, and keeping that no at nearly 100%. So wherever the foreign location has a strong, or at least a material influence on the gross profit, you can say that the two investment locations are not comparable, and you can conclude that somebody who sets up a hotel building at the North Pole will have genuine economic motives for that, and not only taxation. So where the whole bundle of circumstances at the location which you choose is relevant, and not only the tax rate, there you can risk to offer the exemption method. So if you have that in mind, the exemption method becomes less risky. So compare a hotel at the Polar Circle with something in the city center of Frankfurt, Maine, where all the investment bankers are and where the big money is, and where people probably pay huge amounts when they have to pay for an overnight stay for a business trip. To run a factory somewhere in the Bahamas is completely different from running the same kind of factory in the outskirts of Munich in Bavaria. Completely different conditions. not only the tax rate is different. And indeed, you will see that although the Bahamas nearly have no tax, more firms prefer to set up factories in Bavaria. So here, the complete bundle of circumstances which is offered at that location is still more attractive in spite of the tax rate difference than what the Bahamas can offer. The same with income from employment. If somebody says you can take up a job in the Principality of Liechtenstein, there is a very low tax rate. I believe 25% approximately is the highest which you can ever pay there. On the other hand, you will have other questions combined with that offer. How high or low is the gross wage there? How high or low are the costs of living? So if I have a strongly increased net income, will I have to spend all that net income so that below the line nothing remains? Or what are the working conditions? Etc., etc. So many factors influence your decision here. So not only the tax. So everywhere where this condition applies, that changing the location for your activity does not only change the tax rate, but also change a bundle, or at least one material other factor, which influences the gross profit. There you can offer the exemption method. Now you will ask yourself, is there at least one activity in the world where you can say there the gross profit is independent of the location? And yes, there is, because interest is usually only dependent on the currency in which it is paid, the individual risk of the debtor, and nothing else. So the gross profit for investment alternatives when you give a loan is usually within the area of the same currency, always the same if the two potential debtors who take your loan have the same liquidity and rating. So there the tax would be the only difference. That explains why probably all over the world you will never find, in all probability never find, the exemption method granted for interest income. It's far too dangerous. Imagine the gross interest rate is 4% before tax. Now imagine Germany takes 25% tax on interest, so 3% net would remain. But now imagine there is another country which only takes 20%. Then of the 4%, 3.2% net would remain, and it would be clear that immediately afterwards billions and trillions would immediately be shifted to that location, because there the investors would have a higher net profit. So that is what no state will ever risk, to grant the exemption method for interest income. A bit more difficult is to understand why the exemption method is also unpopular for portfolio investment dividends. Usually you would say a dividend from a French firm is created in France, and so it is created under different circumstances from a dividend from a German firm. In principle, that's right. Now with portfolio dividends, you very often have a group of enterprises. So you might imagine there is a multinational group where they have subsidiaries in Germany, France, Italy, and the US. So the location where the profit is generated would be Germany, France, Italy, and the US. And now where the dividend comes from would be dependent on where the holding enterprise is located. And here you can see that if you place a holding in Germany, the dividend would come from Germany. If the holding is placed in the Principality of Liechtenstein, the dividend would formally come completely from Liechtenstein. Or if it's placed in the US, it would formally completely come from the US. And that is a situation where also only the tax and a mere formality where you place a holding would make the only difference. So the gross profit created by all these subsidiaries all over the world would remain the same, and only the tax treatment would be different. That is why, at least for portfolio dividends, a wise legislator will never agree to the exemption method. It might be different, for example, when you have a group and a parent company has an 80% holding in a subsidiary in the US. Here, you do not have the possibility to run that game with where do we place a holding in between. Here, you still have a strong relationship between the original investment. I set up a subsidiary in the US, or I set up a subsidiary in Italy. That makes a difference, but not for the portfolio investor who gives money to multinational holding. Well, okay, so let's sum it up. The exemption method is in theory a risk. In practice, wherever choosing a foreign location for an activity changes the gross profit and the other changes the gross profit and the factors which influence the gross profit, gross revenue, there you can risk to offer the exemption method without the risk of grave distortions in the market. The few exemptions where you can never risk that is probably interest and dividends. By the way, in that context, these two types of income are very often named passive income. There you will probably not find the exemption method. In practice, when you have double taxation treaties with nearly every country all over the world, and most types of income in the double taxation treaty are then treated with the exemption method, then you very often end up with an actual situation where your taxpayer in the inland only pays taxes for nearly only the income from his own country of residence. But nevertheless, the rules which say you are an unlimited tax liability taxpayer still remain valid. The only thing which the exemption method does is you are an unlimited tax liability taxpayer. Only parts of your worldwide income are declared tax-free. So when nearly 90% of your worldwide income are exempted by the exemption method, you still remain an unlimited tax liability taxpayer with a right to a basic allowance, with a right to the deduction of children's allowances, with the right to deduct other special expenses, and with the application of the regular tax tariff in 32A of the ESTG. So, exemption of a part of your income by a double taxation treaty does not change your basic taxpayer status. Good. How can the exemption method be implemented? So we know now the basic idea. We declare the foreign income as tax-free. Now you can do this on a unilateral basis. So you can write into your laws on your own without any agreement with others. We renounce on the taxes for the following foreign types of income. That is not done in Germany. In Germany, we have a principle that the exemption method, that is the most favorite method which we know to avoid double taxation, is only granted for income from states with which we have concluded a double taxation treaty. It's a kind of that special treat which we reserve for countries which agree to a double taxation treaty with us. The idea is that's our incentive. If you conclude a treaty with us on the avoidance of double taxation, we grant to our taxpayers the best possible conditions for investments in your state which can be imagined. So when you have the information that in a certain given case the money comes from a country where we have no double taxation treaty concluded with, then you automatically know that the exemption method is out of play, so that it cannot come into consideration. Well, this is, on the other hand, no God-given principle. For example, at least in former times, France had the strategy or policy that it applied the exemption method in the business sector in its unilateral domestic law. So even without a double taxation treaty, France said, we only tax business income from our own territory. And there is even another approach. Many Anglo-Saxon countries, or nearly all of them, have decided not to use the exemption method at all. So they said, we think that privilege that people get away with a lower tax rate if they invested abroad, let's say 10% abroad, is something which we regard as horrendous. We never ever agree to the exemption method. So many countries do not even practice the method at all. Oh, good. Now, by the way, we should think about motives for granting the exemption method. We have up to now only heard there is an exemption method, how it works, and that it can be risked that somebody gets away with 10% instead of 60%. Now the question is, why should a state allow this? Even if it can be done, why should it be done? This should be discussed immediately now. So let us now talk about the economic necessities or the economic reasons why a state should be so generous to renounce on additional own taxes and be satisfied with that you pay the local taxes abroad. So why should the exemption method be granted? Well, in the final effect, it's a question of fairness in competition or equal chances of competition. That can be best shown by an example. Imagine that we have an investor from state A, and state A has a home state rate of 60%, just to make the example especially nice. Now that investor from state A invests in state B, where the local tax rate is 10%. And the investment is really great. So you can invest 1 million, and after 1 year you have 1 million of profit. So a 100% profit rate. So that would be highly attractive to make it possible for your people to take part in that market. Now, what will an investor do in such a case with the net profit? Well, I think in my constellation, you have 100% profit rate. It seems to be a very clear thing that when you have enough money saved up, that you reinvest that money into that profitable sector. So to obtain growth for your enterprise. And everybody else will do the same. So imagine my investor is now taxed under the credit method with 60%. Then what happens is, in the first year, you have a profit of 1 million. The net amount remaining is 400,000. You save up that money. Next year, 1 million profit, 400,000 net are remaining. 1 million again, 400,000 net in the third year. After 2.5 years, you have 1 million net amount, and you directly reinvest it for, let's say, the second factory or the second gold mine or the second profitable machine, whatever that investment was, where you invested the first million. Now, you live in country A, but the investment took place in country B. Naturally, when the people see how productive, how famous, how fantastic this investment opportunity is, you will have locals who compete with you. And now let's look to the situation of a local competitor. That local competitor does not live in country A with a tax rate of 60%. He or she lives in the local area where the tax rate is 10%. So the local competitor has in the first year 1 million gross profit, 900,000 net profit remain. Second year, 1 million profit, 900,000 net profit remain. So third year, well, we don't need to think about the third year, because for the local investor, the time to generate the second million for the second investment of 1 million is only 1.1 year. So after 1 year and approximately 1 month or 2 months, he or she has already saved up the second million, whereas you needed 2.5 years because you lived in country A, where you had that higher tax rate. So what is the economic effect of that if you look at it over time? If you compare now the growth of the two enterprises, both set up in country B, the blue investor is the one from country A with the 60% tax burden due to the credit method. In the first year or after the first year, the net equity is 1.4 million. The local has 1.9 million. After another year, you, the blue one, are at 1.8 million. The local investor is already at 2.8 million. Next year, your equity goes up to 2.2. The local has already 3.7. You see that the distance gets bigger and bigger each year. And my graphic has not even taken into account that the money is reinvested into productive things, because naturally in my second year already the yellow investor, the local one, should or would not have 900,000 net profit, but 1.8 million net profit, because from year 2 onwards the local investor would already have acquired the second machine, the second minerals, oil source, or whatever it was what is so productive. So the difference between the market chances, the growth chances of the two competitors would explode over time. It's exponentially different. You did this to the blue investor just by insisting on the additional slice of tax payments to the home country. So insisting on the credit method can have a very negative impact on the chances of your people in a foreign market, especially where you have fantastic rentability. There, your people suffer a strong economic disadvantage because in the long run, they will be outspeeded by their local competitors. And that's a bad idea. Just to say we want to remove double taxation so that our people can enter the foreign market. Well, okay, and then our system programs that they will die there in the competition with their local competitors. That makes no sense. This is like a bullfight. The bull can enter the arena. There are rules for a fair fight, and in the end, the rule is that the bull is always dead. That is letting your investors into a foreign market and insisting on the credit method. Well, a bullfight. Go fight against the torero. The rule is, in the end, you will be dead under all circumstances. That is programmed in this situation. Now, what if the local tax rate is 45% and yours is only 50? Okay, then you have a very small difference. But then you can ask questions. First, is it really worth the credit method for the small difference? Okay, and then even a small difference in the long run triggers and exponentially create a growing difference between the chances of the two competitors. So yes, there is always that distorting effect when you apply the credit method. So the data here show that without the exemption method, your investors will always have no fair chance in the local market in comparison to their local competitors. So you would either have to guarantee that your own country always has the lowest tax rate in the world, because then the credit method has no negative impact. It always leads to the highest tax burden. So if the local tax burden is higher than the home state tax burden, you don't have a problem. But in real life, it can't be ensured that you always have the lowest tax rate in the world. There is always a cheaper country. Well, or the other thing is you could only avoid the negative competition effect by application of the exemption method. There is, in theory, a third possibility. You can make sure that local competitors and competitors from other countries with lower tax rates cannot exist just by forbidding them to enter the market. This is also not realistic. So to avoid the negative competition effect by the application of the exemption method is the only solution which you have. Now you might ask yourself, how did these Anglo-Saxon countries do it? Because they never practiced the exemption method. They always insisted in the credit method. Well, it might be that there is an explanation for that. Did you ever hear about that principle of a worldwide income taxation, but on a remittance basis? In former times, that was very popular in the Anglo-Saxon systems, especially in England. There is something like taxation on a remittance basis mentioned in literature some 50 years ago. That seems to have been a rule that the worldwide income was only taxable if it was remitted, transferred to England. So their system was, as long as you invested the money in the local market, it was not regarded as a taxable worldwide income part. Only when you withdrew the money from there. So what these Anglo-Saxon countries, especially probably England, seems to have had is a kind of a mixture between an exemption method, as long as you leave the money there where it is invested, produced and reinvested, and a credit method at the moment when you take the money home. So even they gave in, evidently or supposedly, to the economic constraints which are there by and which force you to practice a kind of exemption method, at least temporarily. Seems to be the case with that remittance basis thing. Okay, now we have seen how the exemption method works, how we can take the risk that, well, there is a lower tax rate abroad without that our people shift all their investments and activities abroad and ruin their own country. And we have even heard just now why it's even economically, for reasonable, wise people, compelling to practice the exemption method under certain circumstances, or at least something which comes close to the exemption method. Now the next question is naturally, how is the exemption method implemented? Germany says, just to repeat that, or to say that, Germany only applies the exemption method in cases where we have a double taxation treaty with the other state. So we say our investors get the best chances, the optimal chances to invest in your country only if you make a treaty with us. So that's our incentive to motivate other countries to make treaties with us. For you, that means if there is no double taxation treaty, you can skip, eliminate, and forget about the exemption method. It will not be granted by German law. Other countries practice it unilaterally, and as already mentioned, France and the UK and the USA don't even practice it in general. They always insist on the credit method, maybe with slight modifications. Now, let's further go to the technical details. What does it mean if a certain activity is exempted under the exemption method? Then the income will be exempt, so tax-free. Now the income is either a profit or a loss. A loss is nothing else than a profit with a negative sign. So the prevailing theory in Germany is that if, let's say, a foreign permanent establishment is declared tax-free, in Germany under a double taxation treaty, then also losses resulting from that permanent establishment are tax-free, so are not tax relevant, are taxable with an amount of 0 in Germany. So you can't deduct losses from a tax-free activity. That is a very unpleasant effect of a double taxation treaty exemption. You must know that, definitively, because it spoils the fun for many investments abroad. On the other hand, economically, that's also convincing. Otherwise, we would open up a permanent establishment somewhere in France, would make a loss of 2 million in year 1, would deduct it at home, and in year 2 we would recover the 2 million as a profit, and then would say it's tax-free in Germany. That can't be. So you can only treat the losses and the profits from the same activity in a uniform way. That is why the losses are also then tax-free. So where the losses will then be computed as 0. Now you have also a second effect. It's about the progressive rate. When you have an income tax with a progressive rate, then the idea behind a progressive rate is always that when somebody is very rich, the tax rate should be high. When somebody is very poor, the tax rate should be very low. And when somebody has an income situation somewhere in the middle, the tax percentage should be somewhere in the middle. Now, your and my problem is when you have tax-exempt income, then your taxable income, so what you have to pay taxes on in Germany, does not reflect your total wealth correctly. Imagine you have 500,000 euro worldwide income. Now, 490,000 shall be exempt under the exemption method because they come from a shop in France. So only 10,000 euro taxable income remain to be taxed in Germany. Now, what does that mean for the tax rate? If you only look to 10,000 euro income, then you would get the impression that person is extremely poor. According to official estimates, you need approximately 9,500 euro to survive decently in Germany. So you would have a disposable income to go to the cinema, to book a holiday, or to celebrate a nice Christmas of 500 euro per year only. So you would be really, really poor. The tax tariff reflects that such a person pays less than 1% of the total income as income tax. But now that would not be adequate for you because you have all over the world 500,000. So 0.5% or so is not a tax rate for somebody who has 500,000 worldwide. And therefore, you must in that case make an auxiliary calculation. The idea must be, okay, this guy has to pay taxes on 10%, but the rate should reflect that person's wealth. And so the question must be, how rich is that person really? And you would find out, okay, the worldwide income is 500,000. Then you would have to ask your law, what is the adequate, socially adequate, just and fair tax rate for somebody who has a worldwide income of 500,000? Then there is only one way to find out. Calculate what a 500,000 person would normally have to pay. By the way, under the current legal situation, it would be approximately 208,000. Okay. Now we can set that into relation and find out 280 in relation to 500. That's 41.6%. Okay. So what we find out is if all your worldwide income were taxable, then you would have to pay 208,000. That corresponds to 41.6%. That means that from the perspective of our law, somebody with 500,000 should decently pay 41.6% on his or her income. And when you once know this, then you can go back to the taxable income. Here somebody has 10,000 to pay taxes on in Germany. But the adequate tax rate, as we found out from that auxiliary calculation, is not the tax rate for the very poorest of the poor, but is a tax rate of 41.6%. So we apply that to the taxable 10,000. And we give that person a tax notice. Please pay 41.6% of your taxable 10,000 which you have in Germany, so 4,160. Well, it remains tax-free, the 490,000 which you have in your French business, because we said, okay, that's the business of the French. And how much the French regard as adequate for a business of 490,000, that's the French, for the French to decide. But we have to tax the 10,000 according to our ideas of justice, and our ideas of justice were that, or are, that a rich person should pay a rich tax rate, a high one, a poor person a low one, and a person in the middle, one in the middle, and a person in the middle between the middle and the highest, a rate in the middle, between the middle wages, percentages and the highest, and so on. And so you do that auxiliary calculation. That is how you determine how much such a person should pay. And this auxiliary calculation and the rule that you have to determine the appropriate tax rate in cases of exempt or tax-free profits by such an auxiliary calculation, that is usually called the proviso, so the rule, which safeguards the progression, so the proviso safeguarding progression. Okay, so that is what you must definitively understand when it comes to the exemption method. First, technical peculiarity, also losses will be exempt. Second, if you have an income tax case, so when there is a progressive rate, the progression will usually be kept up by the auxiliary calculation, which is called the proviso safeguarding progression. Okay, that shall be enough for this video. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon back for some example cases where we illustrate how it works. Okay, goodbye and thanks.